Some mornings, the church is full. The doors are open. The seats are taken. The music begins on time. And still, something feels strangely quiet. Not the kind of quiet that rests your soul. The other kind. The quiet that makes you wonder if heaven is listening or simply distant. People smile. They greet each other. They know the rhythm of the service by heart. But deep inside, there is a question that rarely finds a voice. Where did the fire go? Not the public fire, not the loud moments. I mean the private warmth, the kind that used to meet you in prayer, when you were alone, when no one was watching, when you didn't need to prove anything. If you've been there, you know it's confusing, because nothing is wrong on the outside. You're still showing up, still trying, still doing what you know how to do, and yet your heart feels far away. It's a strange ache to be near the language of God, but missing the nearness of God Himself. Tonight, I don't want to rush past that ache. No dates, no famous names, no quick conclusions, just an honest beginning. Because some of the most important spiritual seasons, I don't look dramatic. They look normal. They look like routine, like habit, like tired faith that keeps walking, even when it no longer feels like flying. So let's take a slow breath together. Let your shoulders drop. Let the noise in your mind soften. And let me ask something gently, not to accuse you, not to push you, but to open a door. What if the most dangerous distance from God isn't when we run away, but when we stay close enough to look faithful, while quietly learning how to live without wonder? Lean in, because if that's where you are, this story is not about someone else. It's about the place you're standing in right now, and it begins in the silence. There is a kind of spiritual danger that almost never alarms us. It doesn't arrive with rebellion. It doesn't shout. It doesn't break rules. It settles in quietly. Faith becomes familiar. Language remains correct. Beliefs stay intact, but somewhere along the way, the heart stops trembling. We still pray, but carefully. We still listen, but selectively. We still believe, but from a safe distance. And slowly, without noticing, we learn how to manage God. Instead of meeting Him, I've often thought about this, how easy it is to confuse consistency with closeness. You can be consistent for years and still feel hollow. You can serve faithfully and still sense that something essential has slipped away. Not because God has changed, but because we have learned how to function without needing His presence to feel real. This is the quiet crisis. Not opposition, not doubt, but familiarity without awe. The hardest part is this: nothing forces us to stop. No collapse, no scandal, no clear breaking point, just a gradual cooling of desire, of faith that works, but no longer wounds us in the best way, no longer interrupts us, no longer leaves us undone. At some point, many people silently conclude, this must be maturity. This must be what steady faith feels like, but I wonder if something else is happening. What if the ache you feel is not failure, but invitation? What if restlessness is not a threat to faith, but a sign that your soul remembers there was once more? And if that's true, then the story we're stepping into is not about recovering emotion, but about recovering hunger. Because awakenings do not begin when people are impressed. They begin when people are honest enough to admit, I am near God, but I am not with Him. And that realization, quiet, personal, unshareable, is often the first crack where light begins to enter. However, sometimes, spiritual awakening doesn't begin with excitement. It begins with discomfort, a quiet sense that something unseen is drawing closer, a feeling that truth is no longer distant, but uncomfortably near. People don't suddenly become louder, they become quieter, not because they are told to be silent, but because something inside them is listening. Imagine a community where nothing on the surface has changed. The same gatherings, the same words, the same routines, and yet hearts begin to feel exposed. Not shamed, not attacked, exposed. As if a light has been turned on, not in the room, but inside the conscience. Suddenly, faith is no longer theoretical, it is personal. No one is forcing emotion, no one is demanding response. And yet, people feel a strange weight, the weight of being seen as they truly are. This is often where we misunderstand awakening. We assume it begins when people react, but it actually begins when people realize how carefully they have kept God at a respectful distance, close enough to worship, far enough to remain unchanged. And here is the uncomfortable part. Moments like these are rarely led by people who look powerful. They are not driven by charisma, or volume, or strategy. They are usually carried by someone almost invisible, someone who has learned how to stand under truth before ever speaking it, someone whose authority does not come from confidence, but from submission. This is the hidden axis of the story, not the crowd, not the moment, but the unseen life behind it. And as we move closer to that life, we begin to understand something quietly unsettling. God often prepares awakening in places we would never live stream. In hours, no one counts. In prayers, no one hears. In faithfulness that feels small, repetitive, and painfully ordinary. 2. Pause. Here is the part of the story we rarely linger on, because it doesn't look impressive. Before hearts are shaken, someone has already been shaken in private. Before truth feels heavy to a community, it has already pressed down on a single soul. Not in moments of inspiration, but in long stretches of obscurity. This kind of person is easy to overlook. They do not demand attention. They do not dominate the room. They are not skilled at creating moments. What they know how to do is remain present when nothing seems to be happening. They sit with questions longer than most people tolerate. They pray when prayer feels dry. They stay still when leaving would be easier. And over time, something forms. Not confidence, not charisma. Weight. The kind of weight you feel before you understand why. I sometimes wonder if we underestimate how much God values. A life that refuses shortcuts. A life that is willing to feel weak, unproductive, even forgotten, rather than replace dependence with efficiency. Because there is a difference between knowing about God and being undone by Him. One produces information, the other produces authority. And authority of this kind is never loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. When it speaks, people don't respond out of excitement. They respond because something inside them recognizes truth before the mind can explain it. This is the midpoint where many viewers lean in, not because the story becomes bigger, but because it becomes closer. Because suddenly, the question shifts. It is no longer, how did awakening happen back then? It becomes, what kind of inner life would God trust with something like that? And perhaps more personally, what have I been avoiding in my own quiet hours with God? There comes a moment, quiet, unmistakable, when faith stops feeling familiar and starts feeling dangerous again. Not dangerous because it threatens punishment, but dangerous because it threatens comfort. This is the moment when people realize they have not lost belief. They have lost closeness. And that realization lands softly at first, like a thought you try to brush away, but it stays. It shows up in prayer, when words feel in. It appears in worship, when singing feels correct, but distant. And slowly, a different kind of fear takes shape. Not fear of judgment, not fear of failure, fear of separation. The fear that you could spend your whole life near the presence of God without ever truly resting in it. This is where hearts begin to tremble, not outwardly, but inwardly. No one tells them to respond. No one demands emotion. Yet something inside loosens. Defenses soften. Explanations fall quiet. Justifications lose their strength. People stop asking, "What is required of me?" and begin asking, "What has happened to my love?" This is the true climax. Not when voices rise, but when resistance falls. Not when people are moved, but when they are undone. Because once the heart reaches this place, awakening is no longer something you observe. It is something you undergo, and it changes the way you listen, the way you wait, the way you remain still. From this moment on, faith is no longer about control. It becomes about surrender. Not dramatic, not public, but deeply personal. Long pause. Here's what remains. After the moment has passed, not excitement, not spectacle, not stories to impress others. What remains is a quiet knowing. God does not need louder voices. He does not need stronger personalities. He does not need better performance. He looks for hearts, willing to be emptied before they are ever filled again. And perhaps that is why true awakening always feels rare, not because God is unwilling, but because hunger is costly. Hunger requires space. Space requires letting go, and letting go means admitting that we have grown comfortable. I find this unsettling and strangely hopeful, because it means awakening is not reserved for the gifted, the confident, or the visible. It begins with ordinary people who are brave enough to stop pretending they are satisfied. So let me leave you, not with instruction, not with urgency, not with a call to act, but with a quiet question. You don't need to answer out loud. If God once chose to move through lives that felt small, in seasons that felt cold, through faith that felt tired, then the real question is not whether he still can. The question is closer than that. Are we still willing to hunger again? Not for intensity, not for experiences, but for presence. And maybe, just maybe, that gentle, honest hunger, the kind that has no words, no performance, no certainty, is where awakening has always begun. Thank you for staying until the end. That already says something about your heart. If this story met you quietly, if it put words to something you've been carrying, you are not alone. You're welcome to share. Not advice, not answers, just a few honest words in the comments. Sometimes naming the ache is already a form of prayer. And if this space has been gentle for you, you can leave a like or subscribe so we can keep creating moments of stillness like this, one story at a time. Until then, stay gentle with your soul.